Hi, this is Deanna Kosaraju from Global Tech Women. I am sorry about the delay. We had a technical challenge, but leave it to two technical women to figure out how to make it work. So with that, I would really like to introduce you to our next session. It is building a local entrepreneurship ecosystem, challenges and opportunities. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. A couple of housekeeping items. Please use the chat over on the right-hand side to ask questions or to network with one another. I will be moderating that chat session for Hanan when she's ready for questions. And also, I'm going to be putting a presentation up on the screen. You can drag and drop it anywhere on the screen you'd like. And also, you have to advance the screen yourself, or the slides yourself. So Hanan will occasionally tell you what slide number she's on so that you can follow along with her. So with that, here she is.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's really great to be here and talk to all of you about entrepreneurship and women in Egypt. It's a very special day for all of us, and I'm really happy to be here. So basically, to start, the reason we chose this topic is that there is a very close connection between the International Women's Day and what's been happening in Egypt in the past few years in terms of the rise of entrepreneurship and the rise of startups, and how this has really been in many ways changing the economy and changing the technology scene in the country. So basically what I'll do today, if you just go to your content slide, which is slide number 2, is I'll talk a bit about the rise of entrepreneurship in Egypt. I'll give you an overview about the ecosystem players, what we have in terms of financing, incubators, how the government is interacting, and so on. And then I'll share with you some reflections based on my discussion with the different members of this ecosystem about what we see as working and what are the problems we're currently facing and hope to change over the future period of time. And then we'll reflect a bit about the interactions between the local startup scene and the global startup scene, specifically in places like Silicon Valley and others, which to many of us are the examples we're trying to learn from. I'll talk a little bit about the role of women, because this is an important part of the story we're trying to tell. And then we'll talk a bit about what's next and what we hope to happen over the next period or over the next few days. So basically, to start, I'm talking here about the rise of entrepreneurship in Egypt, and I'll go directly to slide number 4 that you should see. Okay, so what you're seeing now is basically a Google chart telling us when did the word entrepreneur or entrepreneurship start becoming interesting for the Egyptian population specifically. When did they start really searching for it, looking for resources that talks about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and so on. And interestingly enough, you'll see that this is actually all starting in 2011. That was the first time this started becoming an interesting topic. And the level of interest and the level of curiosity in this topic in 2011 basically skyrocketed all of a sudden. Now, if you're at all paying attention to what's happening politically in the country and in the region, you'll remember that 2011 is actually a year that's very important for us over here, because it's the year of the Egyptian Revolution. That was January 2011 specifically. And to many of us, we see a very close connection between both topics, between the rise of independent entrepreneurs who want to have their own startup and that kind of collective feeling of wanting to drive a strong change and wanting to have a strong effect on the country and on what's happening. So basically, if you proceed to the following slide, you'll see how we're really attributing this in many ways to a lot of things that had to do with the Egyptian Revolution, related to internet usage, digital tools becoming something widespread and widely used by the population, and that kind of belief in the power of the individual that this revolution started in the region and in the youth of the region. If you are to look at it in terms of the components that made it up, We believe that there were three main drivers that contributed to this kind of interest in 2011. They are described on your slide 6. And basically, we can categorize them as cultural, technological, and economic. In terms of culture, together with the revolution, we started having that growing sense of independence and the can-do-it attitude that started becoming very prevalent among the youth in the country. We also started having a lot of concepts that were kind of dormant for a while, like that kind of belief that really one person can make a change, one person can really affect the country politically or economically and so on, which is closely related to the behavior of an entrepreneur and the startup who in many ways is doing that by just believing in a concept and pursuing it and believing in how it can cause a change and how it can create an impact. Sociologically or culturally as well, there was the fact that so many people who have been outside the country for so many years and probably working in the Silicon Valley or in other places which have a very mature entrepreneurship and startup culture started also coming back to the country after 2011 because now they believed that it was a place where they can have an impact. So they wanted to come back and add to that ecosystem and drive it forward. And all these factors together has a huge contribution on the rise of the startup culture in Egypt. The second thing is actually technological. Something that happened overnight, almost overnight, is that the internet penetration sort of skyrocketed. There were a lot of people that were connected but not interested. You would not really find them on social media or using digital services or anything like that before the revolution. But the fact that they saw how this all started online, all these youth were communicating inline and making their arrangements about the sit-ins and all of that online, created a very high curiosity that drove a lot of people to just come online, start experiencing that platform and understanding what happens with it. And that actually created a very interesting phenomena for a lot of people who are interested in technology, because now they saw that they have a huge audience online that they can target with a lot of services. So that was another factor that also contributed. Economically, it was sort of a problem that made startups relevant or very relevant, which is the fact that after the revolution, we had a very slowing economy in the country. A lot of foreign investments stopped coming in, a lot of companies started maybe laying off people and so on. So that created the need for this kind of independent project or independent company that people would start on their own, which in many ways was the driver for some people to come and experience what that entrepreneurship thing meant and how they can be effective members in it. So moving along after that first initial interest, let's look a bit about how the ecosystem is shaped in Egypt, who are the participants, and what are their different roles. Like any country in the world, basically the members that contribute to the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Egypt are basically the entrepreneurs, the one who create the startups and work on them and believe in them. The accelerators and incubators that started appearing only a couple of years ago in the country. Universities and government, of course, and we'll talk about them. The community, which can be titled as maybe NGOs or event creators, or just having a very active events culture and ecosystem. Sorry. And finally, the venture capitalists. So if we go through this one by one, you'll actually be surprised to find out that maybe the most important and the ones who actually started a huge part of the movements in Egypt were actually the event organizers. So we'll talk about them first, but before we do that, let's go to slide 9 and talk about our entrepreneurs and our startups. So just a little bit of history about Egyptians. We always have this maybe local sayings that Egyptians have always preferred government jobs that has been historically their preference. They like it safe. We're not known to be among the countries that typically have a lot of people who go into private businesses or who travel a lot seeking different options and so on. We are kind of the kind of people who play it safe just because historically we've been living around the Nile for years and so on. So why this is important is because it is in a big contrast to that whole entrepreneurship movement that's happening in the country. So this is just something to have in the back of your minds. What we actually have now in Egypt is that we have, to an extent, a great number of startups, in the tens probably. However, that was almost zero a few years back. They started out mostly working in very similar areas, social media, event systems, e-commerce, and stuff like that. However, as they started maturing a bit and many more people came into the playing field, we started having significant startups that just started standing out. And here I'm just mentioning a couple of examples to give you an overview about what kind of startups we have. So for example, you'll find the names of 5 of them on the slide, slide number 9, if you've just joined us. So among the ones on the screen, you'll find that one of them is technology startup that focuses on reporting bugs in apps. That's Instabug. It's one that actually have been getting a lot of attention worldwide from newspapers in events and so on. And they've been winning international competitions and so on. So they have a very interesting product. Integrate, which is an electronics simulation startup basically. And what's very interesting about them is that they have in many ways been one of the first to go beyond the limitations of the Egyptian entrepreneurship ecosystem and go for crowdsourcing on Kickstarter, which is one of the global platforms for crowdfunding. I'm sorry, and they actually had a very successful campaign over there that closed in a few hours. You can also find that some of these startups are starting going to international accelerators and incubators, like the green logo you have on the screen, which have been part of 500 startups. And they are not all specifically IT and technology startups, but you have also other kinds. So Carm Solar, for example, the one with the colorful logo, is one of the few startups in the country to focus on solar energy. And they are the first company in the region to install a high-capacity off-grid solar water pumping station in the Middle East and North Africa. And then you have the last one, Mopser, which is a tool that helps visually impaired individuals get more information about the objects around them through a learning system. So even though we have a few number of startups, yet we are at the point where we are starting to see some of them stand out and have an actual presence that's felt globally and reported on. The second component of the ecosystem, if you move to the following slide, slide number 10, is actually just organizations operating to support entrepreneurs and event organizers who are trying to bring the community together. And as I mentioned, that has been one of the pillars that really started out early enough and drove a lot of attention and interest in the community. So for example, Egypt is one of the countries that actually has a huge number of startup weekends. This is a global organization that promotes the kind of events that happens over a weekend, where young people just come together to pitch ideas, form teams, and do prototypes over a very hectic weekend until they have one winner. So in many ways, it teaches entrepreneurs how to work together and get something quickly out. And it's one of the things that have been happening quite a lot in Egypt. And interestingly enough, even though Egypt has usually been a very centralized country where everything happens in Cairo, this kind of event has been happening all over the place, not only in Cairo. We had some of them in Cairo, in Alexandria, even in the south, in Luxor and Aswan and others, which is a great way to market the concept and get a lot of more youth to learn about it. And you also have some local organizations doing the same, like in Jazz. You have some of the other global events like Startup Cup, which has been very famous in Egypt. The peak of this kind of activities that aim to bring the ecosystem players together, however, has been a very interesting event that happened just last November called Rise of Egypt. And Rise Up Egypt actually was an event where for the first time you brought everybody, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, incubators, big digital players into one place to have a lot of panels, discussions about how the ecosystem is shaping out, what we need, how can we work together better, which is a very significant step because many people saw it as the dawn of a new era, not of just distributed activities, but something that aims to bring all of the communities together. And an interesting comment here is actually the name of the event. Rise Up is in many ways a symbol chosen by the organizers of the event that this kind of startup economy is really something that's needed for the rise of Egypt from the state that's been in the past few years to go to a better future or something better in the next few years. And just a final comment about this part, it's actually something that has been quite controversial in our country, because even though having all these events is definitely positive because you bring people together, some have been criticizing it for creating more hype than substance, that we're just talking about the concept a lot, even though it's not supporting many startups come to the picture. And we'll talk about that later in the presentation, and we can definitely discuss it together. So, we talked about entrepreneurs, we talked about events, organizers, and NGOs. The other contributor that has been participating in this ecosystem and driving it forward is actually the rise of accelerators and incubators. This is a concept that we never heard of before 2011. The first accelerator that started in Egypt was in 2011. It's called Flat 6 Labs, created by one of the first VCs to operate here. And it's actually one of the most active, not only in Egypt, but in the region. It has graduated almost 40 companies so far in 6 rounds, and is credited for having a lot of exposure to the outside world, supporting their startups go outside, and so on. And actually, the only other private accelerator on this slide is Juice Labs, which is something quite recent that has just started a couple of months ago, and just is starting its first cycle. Interestingly, the other 2 incubators on this slide, one of them is government-backed, which is ITIDA. So basically, it's operating in a very different manner with longer time spans, more of a co-working space rather than an actual accelerator, just giving some minimal support in terms of location and startup capital. An interesting addition was when universities started coming into the picture, because just last year, the American University in Egypt started its own startup accelerator, and they've just graduated their first round and is going into round 2 just these days. The significance of accelerators and incubators in our ecosystem in Egypt is that basically they help a lot of people get started in a place where you don't have old entrepreneurs who've already done it, where you can go to for advice, where everybody's almost listening about entrepreneurship and startup for the first time. This kind of educational program that doesn't only give you funding and space, but also access to mentors, to people to discuss with, is actually something important that is helping us start bringing some startups to the beginning of the funnel, so to speak. If you move to the following slide, slide 12, we'll talk about a very important part of any entrepreneurship ecosystem, which is basically funding and venture capital. So because we have such a young ecosystem, it's actually quite understandable that the kind of VCs and funding that we have can only be categorized into angels and Series A capital, the initial capital that goes into any startup that's just starting. So basically we have something interesting which is called Cairo Angels, and this is a group of angels who came together so that they can support each other in getting to know about the different startups, advising them, and co-investing together. And we also have a few individual angels that are starting to enter the market, basically with very small ticket sizes, maybe $20,000 or less. And then you have the seed and Series A VCs, who are actually organizations working to support entrepreneurs and to invest in entrepreneurs. A couple of them are private VCs focusing on only that. For example, Syrian Ventures on the top and Tafkin Capital. One of them is actually supported through a government fund, Idea Developers, and it's the most active with almost 22 investments to date. Some of them are just large digital holdings like OTVentures with a few investments. And we also have one international player working in the market, which is Vodafone, one of the local operators that are working locally, who's also supporting some startups through their Vodafone Zone initiative. What's interesting about this picture is that basically we are starting to get to the phase where some of the startups are going beyond the Series A. However, this is not something that's available in the country at this point of time. So it's definitely one of the things that we need to start working on. The second thing is, like we've mentioned before, that all of them almost started after 2011, maybe with one exception that started in 2010. So it's all in parallel with that rise in entrepreneurship that we've talked about. And something else of significance here, which we really feel is something that we're losing in the local market and is one of the problems that we're trying to work with, is that most of the investors working inside Egypt are people who either did a little bit of it abroad or are just testing it out and trying it out in the local market, just like the entrepreneurs are. So very common concepts in the US, for example, like having Syrian entrepreneurs turned investors, is not something that we have at this point of time, which in many ways affects the added value that they give the startups other than the financing. Governments and universities are actually some of the weakest components of our local startup ecosystem. The government has really not done anything to support them except having their own incubator and a few sporadic events. In terms of regulations, and because of the political instability over the past few years, we haven't seen the regulations catch up with the move in startups and in entrepreneurship in the country. So we didn't have any changes like a lot of the countries do to make starting a company easier. It's still a very bureaucratic process. And in many ways, it's one of the reasons why a lot of the startups choose to go to incubators and accelerators, just to have some support with that. The other point of significance here is the one related to universities. Even though we have a lot of universities that allow their students to hold entrepreneurship-related events inside them, and one of the universities that had an incubator, like we've discussed, we don't really see that kind of interaction between university, between academia and industry that allows us to have more interchange and have more of maybe the research outputs go into effect as a startup or anything like that. So this is something that's totally missing from the ecosystem at this point of time. So basically, that's just a general overview about the different players in the ecosystem and the state of, or the map of entrepreneurship in Egypt at this point of time. Let's go into this a little bit deeper and discuss the different feedbacks that we're getting from the different members of the ecosystem, and what we see as working and what we see as not. I'm proceeding to slide 14 now. So the first issue that's receiving a lot of attention locally is the issue of replication versus innovation. And we can see that reflected in the fact that basically we saw our startups being compromised of mostly a multitude of social and e-commerce startups. A lot of them are just choosing models that have been tested out in other markets that they have seen online, maybe like Amazon, like Eventbrite, like other things that they've already seen working, and in many ways replicating that locally. Always adding a local flavor, maybe a difference in the language to fit more people locally or so on. But it's definitely one of the items that have been receiving a lot of criticism. that instead of having items that are more relevant to local problems, and I personally always contrast that with some of the other African startup ecosystems like Kenya, for example, or others, where you have a lot of things focusing around farming, around alternative ways of payments, and so on. We did not have that kind of thought in our startups, and we see that as one of the main problems. As you might have seen in our entrepreneurship slide when we talked about some examples, recently we're seeing some stand out. So while they might not be directly related to inclusion or the solving of local problems, we're still having a few that are actually innovative on a technological level, maybe working on solar energy or others. However, they are the minority. And one of the issues that we definitely have is that the majority of our entrepreneurs are choosing to replicate external models and external consumer internet projects that are working abroad, which in many ways might be described as a loss in potential. Another issue is the issue of competition versus cooperation. So basically, another thing that we're always talking about locally when we reflect on the local ecosystem in Egypt is that, as you know, one of the things that always strengthen certain startup ecosystems and make them better and more supportive of their members is when you have a strong network effect, when you have a strong horizontal network where entrepreneurs are talking together, learning from each other, and maybe supporting each other. And to an extent, we're still at that first part of the curve where a lot of people are very conscious and worried about sharing ideas, where we don't have a lot of sharing of details and lessons learned happening between the different entrepreneurs and the different ecosystems. Up to the level of actually having people talking about being afraid of others taking their idea, copying their idea, and so on, which is causing us to have, in some cases, even inside this small ecosystem, some replications between startups instead of the consolidation that can make them stronger and can drive the whole move forward. I personally heard an example from a US-based incubator that had some Middle East startups, and they were mentioning that they found out that two of these startups were working in the same field and living next to each other, actually never talked to each other or collaborated together before they went to that incubator and started working. So it's definitely something that's maybe slowing down the progress of how these startups can be going forward and how we can just share the learning inside the ecosystem. Another important issue that always comes to the question is the question of capital. And maybe this is in many ways related to a conception that we're seeing in the local ecosystem, where we're basically what we're hearing most about from the Silicon Valley or other successful places is mostly about the funding, raising of capital, how the really good startups are the ones that raise a lot of capital, and so on, which might be creating an issue of startups trying to think about that before thinking about how to perfect their business, how to perfect their product. An issue that might be happening in a lot of ecosystem, but in a place where funding already is not much, being so focused in funding can really cause a lot of slowdown. The most important issue, however, that I see is the last one, which is one related to the lack of know-how, the lack of local know-how. As we've mentioned before, in most of the successful startup ecosystem, you always have that model of a Syrian entrepreneur working with other entrepreneurs to help them start their company or get to know some concepts, some ways of perfecting the product, and so on. And because the whole thing is new to us, basically before 2011, you really had very few technology startups. This is not something that we actually have a lot of in the local ecosystem. So you have a lot of people who are testing things out, who are trying for the first time, and not much previous experience that you can base things on or work on. So basically, if I were just to summarize the main issues that we're discussing and seeing in the local ecosystem at this point of time, I would say that we have a very huge question of innovation versus replication. That would be the first one. We tend to have a lot of replication happening in our market. Number two is competition versus cooperation, and how the lack of a strong cooperation culture is really not leading our startups to move forward as fast as they can. Number three is a lot of focus on raising capital, even though, as you all know, this tends not to be the most important question. But in a country where also the capital is not that much, then it starts creating a lot of boundaries for startups. And number four is the lack of past know-how in this field, which can, in many ways, make us move faster in this area. So when we try to answer this question, some of the solutions that people always present or think about in the local ecosystem is how can we interact with the external regions of innovation or the external places where they have quite a strong startup economy, so that we can start transferring some of the knowledge or generally have more cooperation. So I'll move to the second, the following part, which is basically the part about how we see interactions with external ecosystem. And if you go to slide 20, you'll see that basically I'll talk about this in two sections or in two components. The first component is the MENA ecosystem. MENA basically is the Middle East and North Africa. So something that's quite different about this region is basically that you have a number of countries who have a lot of cooperation, are using the same language, and in many ways that means that unlike starting a startup in Germany, for example, in German, where most of your audience would be the locals, out of Egypt or out of any other Middle East country, you always look at the bigger ecosystem, which contains all of the Arabic-speaking countries in the region, which can be potential customers and potential capital providers. So this is actually one of the ties that's progressing in quite a good rate. So you see at this point of time that when you are a startup working on the region, you always can expand your customer reach to all of these countries, which gives you a bigger market segment to reach. So that's one positive point about this kind of interaction. Number two is the financing. I've mentioned in this presentation the sources of finance available inside the country. However, we've seen some cases where startups inside Egypt have been getting funding from other regional VCs, for example, or entering regional incubators. Examples of this VCs might be from UAE, from Jordan and Lebanon, which are actually maybe more mature markets, specifically Jordan, in terms of their venture capital activities and their startups culture. In terms of cooperation, we see some cooperation happening with startups in the other regional countries in the events where people can just see more startups, get more exposure. However, one of the problems that doesn't make this the optimal kind of cooperation is that to a great extent, most of the entrepreneurs and VCs in the region have very close know-how and background. Again, with minor exceptions, you'll find that probably all of the countries in the region are experiencing the same kind of rise in startups and in entrepreneurship just around 2010, 2011, 2012. So it's all a few years background shared between all of these countries. The second type of international interaction that we have in Egypt might be the one with other countries outside the Middle East. And probably most of the startups in the region look at the Silicon Valley as the potential place for gaining knowledge, gaining relationships, and probably raising capital. And this is something that's been rising to a great extent. So, for example, we were seeing incubators based in the Silicon Valley that only focus on the Middle East startups and try to attract over there so that they can help them with the mentoring and the relationships, even if it's just for a couple of months. Examples of that is PitMe, Peace in the Middle East, which is one of the incubators that just started a couple of months ago, taking its first batch of startups over to the Silicon Valley. And it's actually a very unique model that probably is the only one focusing on the Middle East and providing this kind of service. And the general feedback or the general thoughts about this, even when we talk with the organizers of PitMe themselves, is that it's a matter of creating exposure rather than anything else. So even though the entrepreneurs might be there just for 1 month, which might not be a very long period in terms of developing your startup, however, it makes you just get immersed into that ecosystem, see how people work together, how mentorships work, and so on, which can have some kind of effect on the entrepreneurs even when they come back. The second player in this area is probably some of the organizations that are trying to create a connection between the local entrepreneurs and the expats, the Egyptian expats that are living abroad, working in the area, and so on. So this is another thing that we're seeing a rise in. The problem, however, tends to be that that when most of the entrepreneurs look outside, they typically look outside for funding, which is something that a lot of people believe is not very doable. Typically, a VC tends to invest in a startup which is close by, which they can advise and talk to more. So looking outside for funding might not be the most successful approach, and we've seen very minor cases of startups actually ending up getting their finances from outside the region. However, the question of what is the best way to get the know-how from ecosystems that are more developed in terms of startup is definitely a very interesting question that is still receiving a lot of debate and discussions in the region. So just a little bit of an overview about how women are contributing to this startup ecosystem in the country. We actually have a lot of women who are very active participants in the ecosystem, whether specifically for entrepreneurs. So we have a lot of women-led startups that have received funding in Egypt, either from inside Egypt or from outside, and they are among the standout startups. And if you look at slide 22, I have a couple of examples of these if you want to look them up. However, the problem that we're seeing at this point of time is the lack of women investors, women VCs, women angels. In Egypt specifically, I can tell you that maybe out of the VCs that we've looked at a few moments ago, maybe you have like 1 woman managing or working in a big role in one of these VCs. And as is always an international phenomena, when you have less women as investors, you typically tend to have less women as entrepreneurs and less women receiving funding, which is something we need to get over. The fact that we're having a lot of women as entrepreneurs might be something that changes this equation in the years to come, but at this point of time, we're definitely having an issue with that. Middle East-wise, we started having some trends to bring angels, women angels together so that they can create this kind of networks that would support women entrepreneurs and then maybe in the future create VCs that would support later stage funding, not only angel funding, but that's something very in the very early stages at this point of time. So moving forward, what are the main issues that we see as the issues we need to tackle and discuss over the next period and the issues that we need to work out? I would summarize them into 4 items. Number 1 is growing beyond the hype, because at this point of time, one of the biggest issues that you have in the country and in the region is that you always, as an investor, for example, you always measure the success of the entrepreneurship ecosystem by how many successful startups come out of it and how many exits you have in the ecosystem. And we are an ecosystem that almost have minimal exits, almost none in some sectors. So we have that issue of filtering out the crowd, starting to have the first few examples of successful startups that we still need to see them grow and exit the market so that we can have more belief in why this is going to be a phenomenon that creates sustainable success over time. So basically that whole concept of growing behind the hype and the events to have actual successful examples is something we still need to see more of, and it will drive back a lot of more confidence in this entire movement. The other very important thing that we need to see for the second wave to succeed is that we need to start seeing more serial entrepreneurs, something which is just starting, but should be creating a drastic impact on the progress of this entire movement in the country. So just after 3 years of having this whole startup concept, we're now starting to see people enter their second startup for the second time. And we believe that this will have a huge impact. And only with that will we start seeing more growth funds and growth investments, because as we've mentioned at this point of time, basically everybody in the ecosystem is focusing on seed and Series A capital. So it's definitely one of the things that we're still lacking dramatically in this part of the world, and we'll be looking forward to start growing some of these as we start having, again, more successes, more exits, and so on. So that basically concludes my overview about the startup ecosystem and the move of entrepreneurship in Egypt. And I think we can just move this into the discussion mode at this point. So Dana, maybe we can start having a discussion or having some questions. So I'm trying to close my slides so that I can see if you have any questions in the chat box.
That was an amazing session. Uh-oh. Did we lose the sound?
Dana.
Oh no.
I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay, shoo, you scared me. That was, I just went over to check our next speaker, and I came back and there was no sound, and I thought, oh, we lost her. That was really amazing. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to go look in the queue really quick. I have a question if nobody has a question. I'm wondering, with what's going on politically, are you finding that outside investors are having a difficult time investing in the region because of the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the government, or are people jumping in because they see opportunity? What's the sense, what's the feeling you get from the investment community now?
Well, I think over the past 3 years, we really had a lot of ups and downs. There has, even if you look at the general stock market, not necessarily the technology startups, you see that whenever we have a positive change politically, you find a lot of people interested, a lot of people coming into the stock market, a lot of external investors, maybe regional investors talking to our local startups. And then a few days later, you just have some protests and things started going back to that mode of uncertainty. So you start having people having second thoughts. So I would say it's definitely a difficult period for Egyptian startups in terms of raising funds. And unless you're going to have it locally, most probably you will not be able to get something from the outside. One of the trends we have seen with some of the successful startups is that they have moved some of their core members outside the country so that they can receive funding.
I see.
But
Yamala
yes, I do
has a
agree with
question
you.
here.
Yeah,
Do you see that? Okay.
sure. How open is the market to investors from the global setups? Um, Again, I'll focus mainly on the technology sector, and I would say that it's a market that will be difficult for external investors to look at if they don't have some kind of a local partner. And it's not necessarily the regulations part or the government part or having some kind of red tape around that, but it's actually that in many ways it's a market that's changing dramatically because of the political instability. And it's a market that takes a lot of local know-how because it's just a little bit different than the typical markets. So I would say that it is open politically and regulations-wise. However, it's difficult to venture in because of the instability that's happening.
Someone's going to ask questions, and I'm going to ask one more question because I'm a staunch feminist, so I have to ask the next one. I was listening to a broadcast on NPR, National Public Radio, a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about women's rights in Egypt and how the new government seems to be better in terms of the way they're writing the Constitution versus the Muslim Brotherhood who was before them. What's your take on this? Do you think that women's rights are being considered when the Constitution's being written, and do you feel like the women feel that they're being well represented in this new government? Is this a positive turn for women, or do you think it's going to be more of the same?
Interesting question. So how are
You don't have to
women?
answer.
No, that's perfectly fine. It's interesting actually because I think the most difficult thing about the phase we're going through is lack of clarity. It's not that it's difficult or that you see things going in a bad direction necessarily, but that you just don't have a lot of clarity in how things are proceeding from one day to another. If I was to answer that question in general term, I would say that during the latest regime, the Muslim Brotherhood regime, um, when it comes to regulations and actual changes that affects women, really there hasn't been any changes made. However, there were a lot of discussions that left a lot of people in the country feeling very uncomfortable with the direction things would go to. So the kind of discussions around women's rights that were being done in the parliament in the Muslim Brotherhood's times, for example, were discussions that we in Egypt believe that we've went past them since maybe 1920, that we've had women in our office since the 40s and the 50s, and that we've went past them. So these kind of discussions were really keeping us very worried. At this point of time, you see that this kind of discussions about taking certain rights away or anything like that has definitely stopped. So that's a positive thing. The current government is really putting in the picture a lot of women. We have more female ministers in the cabinet than we used to have in the previous one. But I can't say that we've also had any impactful positive changes that would make people feel optimistic in a better government as we go forward. I would say that at this point of time, the problems are too basic to touch upon issues of women. We're still debating things about how the government would look like. Are we going to have a president or go into other kind of unknown regimes? So it's probably not in the spotlight at this point of time.
I can totally understand that. The United States went through something like that itself early on. When the Constitution was written, women were completely left out. So, word of warning, don't make the same mistakes that we made, and make sure that women are definitely called out in the Constitution as being equal partners with men, because we're still fighting that all these years later. We still don't have equal rights in the Constitution. So, don't make our mistakes. Well, that was an amazing session. Okay, good. Well, I'll tell you, having somebody like you doing amazing work in Egypt. You know, you should consider going into politics. I think you're very thorough and you have a good beat on the way the economy is working. And I think that you know, you should think about it. Seriously, think about it. I think you would be brilliant. So I look forward to many more things from you, and I hope that we can collaborate with Global Tech Women. And we're going to be having a conference in a few months on entrepreneurs around the world. And we would love to have you come back and talk about what's going on, what's new since Voices. And we can connect with other VCs and investors around the world and talk about the state of women entrepreneurs and the types of investment that are available to them. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating in this brilliant session. Loved it, loved it, loved it. Our next session is Building Street Cred with Karen Catlin. So if you want to learn about how you can build your reputation as a leader in the field, she's the one you want to talk to next. So thanks so much, Hanan. And hey, I'm so glad we got through the technical issues. It was so worth it.
Great, thank you all very much. And please, if you have any ideas that you can share with us, feel free to contact me with those. Thank you so much.
Thank you.